Today I'm going to show you how to make this quilt from start to finish. It's a free pattern with one block made 36 times and it's rotated to create this stunning geometric design. It's stitch and flip, quilt-as-you-go, and it's fully machine sewn including the binding. Welcome back to Poole TV. If you're new here, I'm Monica, and every week my daughter and I make videos about how we make our quilt-as-you-go quilts. So a couple of weeks ago we were commissioned to make a three-part series on how to make a quilt-as-you-go quilt from start to finish. So this is our edit. We've combined it into one easy video for you. There's heaps of information in it, and if you've ever wanted to make a quilt-as-you-go quilt, it's a free pattern. So what are you waiting for? We'll put the link in the description and you can easily download the pattern. So we hope you enjoy this video. Hi, welcome to my studio. I'm Monica Poole. I'm a fashion designer, quilt designer and sewing tutor, and I've been making quilt-as-you-go quilts for over 25 years. For this series, I've designed this fun, beginner-friendly quilt that's based on a traditional string quilt design. String quilts have been around since the 1800s. They were mostly made from scrap fabrics, all sewn together in strips or strings to form a stunning geometric pattern. Now, I love string quilts, and the reason why I decided to design a beginner-friendly string quilt is because string quilts aren't about the seams and points lining up. It's about the overall stunning geometric design that they create. So we have our light and dark fabric that draw your eye in and take the focus off any other seam. So if it's not lining up, it doesn't matter. So historically speaking, string quilts knew no bounds. So it basically gives you permission to just have fun and enjoy making this quilt and enjoy the process. But before we start sewing, let's talk about the tools and the requirements list. These are the basic tools that I recommend for the everyday person that wants to get started in quilting. They're also the perfect tools for this project. Quilting tools come in inches, but don't let that scare you off. Just get a quilter's tape measure. It has inches on one side and centimeters on the other side, so you can always just double check what those measurements are. You'll need an 18-inch by 24-inch cutting mat, a 24-inch by 6.5-inch ruler, a 12.5-inch square ruler. This is really handy because most quilting blocks are 12.5 inches square. Rotary cutters come in small, medium and large, and if you're starting out, I recommend that you start with the medium, which has a 45mm blade. You should also pick up a pack of spare blades while you're there. Also, rotary cutters are really sharp, so make sure that you get into the habit after every time you cut, you close the blade. And if you're sewing with the kids, just let the adults do the rotary cutting. These size tools are a great place to start because quilting fabric comes folded, meaning that you will easily be able to cut across the width of the fabric. This leads me on to my next topic, fabrics. When it comes to choosing fabrics, start with the colours that you love. You know what you like. For this project, I chose a beautiful Jocelyn Prowse print, and then I just chose some coordinating colours that I thought went really well with it. For my quilts, I always choose lights, medium and dark fabrics. This gives my quilt depth and it also gives it balance. For the top of the quilt, you will need 5 fabrics. So I've got my white, which is my light, navy is my dark, and orange, yellow and pink are my medium tones. You can choose whatever colours you like for this project, and if you need a little bit of colour confidence, pick up a colour and tone guide. It's really easy to use and it's got instructions on the back. So batting. Batting comes in a lot of different varieties, and I like to use a nice flat cotton batting because it's easy to sew through. Use a thin batting for your first quilt because it will help you to get used to sewing through 3 layers. Before you start any project, pre-wash and iron your fabrics because this will remove any shrinkage and excess dyes. And when it comes to batting, check the manufacturer's instructions, as some recommend pre-soaking and drying your batting before you use it. So now you have all your supplies, it's time to start cutting out. It's easy to tell the right side of a printed fabric. Obviously, it's the brighter side, but it can be tricky to find the right side of a solid cotton fabric. The trick is to run your fingers along the selvage. The side with the raised pinholes is the wrong side, and the side that is smooth is the right side. The right side of the fabric also has a smoother feel. If you can't work out the right and wrong side of the fabric and both sides of the fabric look the same, just pick a side and go with it. Press your fabric and fold it with the right side facing out, with the opposite selvage edges together. Make sure that the fabric is smooth and flat. Take the folded edge and fold it over to meet the selvage. Smooth out the fabric, making sure that it is nice and flat. You will now have 4 layers of fabric. To get a straight edge, align the folded edge that is closest to you on a horizontal line of the cutting mat, extending the raw edge past a vertical line slightly. Now this demonstration is for a right-handed person, so if you're left-handed, just put it in reverse. Connect a vertical line of the mat at the top and bottom of the fabric with the ruler. To double check that everything is straight, align a horizontal line of the ruler with the folded edge that is closest to you. Hold the ruler firmly in place with one hand, and with the rotary cutter in the other hand, cut across the fabric, applying pressure to the rotary cutter and running the blade along the edge of the ruler. The thickness of the ruler keeps the blade straight and your fingers safe. Now that you have a straight edge, you can cut strips any size that you like. Now there's 2 ways to do this, and it's just a matter of working out which way you prefer. The first way is to measure using lines on the cutting mat. If you want a 2-inch strip, count 2 spaces, connect the lines at the top and bottom of the fabric and cut. The same thing applies for any size strips by just counting the spaces and cutting. You can also use the numbered measurements at the top and bottom of the cutting mat. The second way is to use the measurements on the ruler. To do this, transfer the straight edge of the fabric to the opposite side. You can do this easily by just spinning the board. Now use the measurements on the ruler to cut your strips. Say you want a 2.5-inch strip, position the 2.5-inch line of the ruler on the edge of the fabric and cut. Always check your first strip to make sure that it's straight before you continue cutting more. Now you have your strips, you can cut them to any size you like. To do this, place your strips on a horizontal line on the cutting mat. Use a vertical line to trim the selvage. Then use either the lines on the cutting mat or your ruler to cut to the size you require. Here I'm going to cut some 4-inch pieces. And then I'm going to cut some 2-inch pieces. So now you know how to cut out. Follow the cutting instructions in the pattern to cut out all the fabrics for your quilt top. So cutting out can take a while, so grab a cuppa and put on your favourite tunes and enjoy the process. Time to cut the backing squares. The backing squares are 9.5 inches, and this is how you cut a square. Fold your backing fabric in the same way and place on your cutting mat. Straighten one edge and measure 9.5 inches from the straight edge in 2 places. Then connect the marks with your ruler and cut. Spin the 9.5-inch strip so that it is laying horizontal on your cutting mat. Remove the selvage by straightening the edge. Measure 9.5 inches again from the straight edge. Cut and repeat this step. This will give you 4 backing squares from one 9.5-inch strip. Continue the process until you have the required amount of backing squares. To cut the batting, unfold it and look for the straight edges. Refold the batting, aligning the straight edges on both opposite sides. Smooth it out so that it is laying nice and flat. Fold it up again, keeping the side edges straight and aligned. Position the folded edge that is closest to you on a horizontal line on your cutting mat. As this is a low loft batting, it's possible to cut through 4 layers at once with your rotary cutter, but if you prefer, you can mark lines with a pencil and cut with your scissors. So, to start cutting the squares, trim the straight edge if necessary, then measure across 8.5 inches and mark in 2 places. Then, connect the lines with your ruler and cut. Open out the strip and place it on a horizontal line on your cutting mat and cut the strip into 8.5-inch squares in the same way as you did for the backing fabric. Continue cutting the squares until you have the required amount. Sometimes batting can leave fluff on your cutting mat, so just grab an eraser and rub in a circular motion to remove it. To make one block, first of all, you'll need a backing square. Place that on your work surface with the wrong side facing up, and then position a square of batting on top so that it's centered and you have a 1/2 inch gap all the way around the edge. When it comes to batting, the fluffy side is the right side and the rough side is the wrong side. If you like, you can hold the layers together with a little bit of basting spray, but I find the cotton batting tends to grip onto your backing fabric. You'll need to mark one line that is 1/4 inch away from opposite diagonal corners. To mark my line, I've just used a 4B lead pencil. This is a nice soft lead and it marks the batting nicely and you don't have to press too hard at all. You'll also need a white strip, one long navy strip, orange strip, a long yellow and a short pink, and a smaller navy, a long pink and a short yellow. This is the top of the block and this is the bottom of the block. To get ready to sew, take one white strip and place it below the marked line so that the opposite diagonal corners are covered by the strip and one edge of the strip is level with the marked line. Take your longer navy strip and place it right sides together with the white strip, also positioning it below the marked line, making sure that it's covering your opposite corners. Take a few pins and pin it in place, pinning through all layers. So I like to set my fabrics up in order so I'm all organized and ready to sew. So at the machine, I have threaded up with a neutral colored thread, something that's also going to look good on the back of the fabric. I have a size 80 quilting needle and you'll need a 1/4 inch seam, so you can either use a 1/4 inch foot or I'm just using my standard foot with my needle position moved over to the right so that I have a distance of a 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the needle. And you'll also need a straight stitch with a length of 3. Stitch the navy and white strips together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sewing through all layers. Start and finish sewing level with the edge of the backing fabric. Also, there is no need to back tack or reverse at the beginning and end of each row of stitching at this stage. Pull your work out from the machine and flip the navy strip over to the right side. Smooth out the seam with your fingers. Check that your stitching and tension is nice on the back of the fabric and adjust if necessary. Take a smaller navy strip, spin your block and place the navy strip onto the opposite side of the white strip with right sides together. Center the strip, making sure you have an even amount extending past each edge of the backing square, and stitch in the same way. Flip over to the right side and head to the iron to press, and be careful to not let the iron touch the batting. Take an orange strip and place it right sides together with the longer navy strip. Center it in the same way that you did for the previous navy strip and stitch. Flip to the right side and smooth out. Spin the block and take a long pink strip and repeat the process. Flip your pink strip and head to the iron and press, making sure you don't press the batting, and be careful not to press any creases into the seam. Take a long yellow strip, placing it right sides together with the orange strip, stitch and flip. Spin the block and place a short yellow strip and stitch and flip. You can see our block is really starting to come together. Head to the iron, giving it a press, and sew on the final small pink strip in the same way. This is what it looks like on the back. It just looks like nice quilting lines. Take your square ruler and place it onto the backing square. Position the number 1 in the top right hand corner. Now just reverse this if you are left-handed. You can see that your block would have shrunk slightly. That's okay. We are going to trim it back to 9¼ inches. So locate that on the ruler. Align the 45-degree line on the center diagonal line. Judge an even distance around the edge of the 9¼ inch square and trim one side edge. Trim across the top and spin your block, so that you have your straight edge on the left side and on the bottom edge. Position the 9¼ inch line on the straight edge and across the bottom edge and trim in the same way. And here is our complete block. So that is how you make a block. Repeat this process and make 36 in total. I like to work on 3 blocks at a time to help speed up the process, but you can do whatever works for you. Just have fun with it. As you complete your blocks, lay them out on the floor, on a table, or on a design wall to form the diamond pattern. Rotate the blocks so that you have some large diamonds and some small diamonds. So I've almost finished making all of my blocks. I absolutely love how this quilt is coming together. It's amazing how the one block design, rotated in different directions, can create this stunning pattern repeat. So take 2 blocks to the cutting mat, place them right sides together so that they are even. Pin the top, bottom and center and head to the machine. At the machine, thread up with a neutral coloured thread, something that blends with all of your fabrics. Now this stitching line won't actually be visible. You can use your standard foot. We need a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance with a straight stitch and a length of 3. Use a tape measure or a ruler to double check that your seam is correct. Most times it's the first line closest to your foot. Start sewing with a reverse stitch at the beginning, slide your pins out as you sew, making sure you keep all the fabric edges level and ease it through gently and finish with a reverse stitch at the end. Take your block to the ironing board. This is what it will look like from the front. You can see not all joins are aligning perfectly, but it still looks good. Flip it over to the back and we are going to press that raw seam open. Now it's okay if you catch a little bit of the batting in the seam, that's fine because we are using a nice flat batting. But it's great not to have the batting going all the way through the seam allowance as it reduces the bulk and helps our seam to lay nice and flat. We are now going to cover the raw seam with the cover strip. I'm going to use this pink fabric for the cover strips on the back of my quilt. Now you can use the same fabric as your backing fabric if you don't want the cover strips to stand out, but I want mine to stand out because I want to make a feature on the back of my quilt and it'll kind of make my quilt reversible. To make the cover strips, fold your fabric with opposite selvages together and then fold it over again so the folded edge meets the selvage edge. Align the fold closest to you on the straight line of the cutting mat, extending the raw edge a little bit past a vertical line. Trim the edge straight, and then using the lines on your cutting mat as a guide, cut 2-inch strips and cut as many as stated in the pattern. Open out your strips to double check that they are nice and straight. Now we're going to prepare our strips with a 1" or 25mm bias maker. And although we're using a bias maker, your strips don't have to be cut on the bias grain, they're just cut across the fabric from selvage to selvage. Cut the end of the strip into a point. Slide the strip through the bias maker with the wrong side of the fabric facing up towards the plastic side of the bias maker. Use a pin to help slide it through the little gap so it comes out the end of the bias maker. Fold the edges in neatly to get started and press. Now tilt the bias maker up on a 45-degree angle. Bring the iron to the bias maker. Slide the bias maker along the ironing board, working about 10 centimeters or 4 inches at a time, making sure that the edges are folded over neatly, and then bring the iron to the fabric. This is what it should look like. The raw edges are folded over neatly in the middle on what will be the back of the cover strip. As our strips were cut across the fabric, it will be a little bit stretchy, and it's going to stretch slightly as you sew it. So I like to remove that little bit of stretch by ironing it again and pulling on the strip as I press. This will give you a nice stable strip to work with. Now mark up your block. Your block measures 9¼ inches, and we want our cover strips to finish ½ inch away from the top and bottom edge. This is for all blocks that will join onto another block. They can go all the way on blocks that will be on the outer edges of the quilt. I'm going to cut my strips at 8¼ inches long. You will get 4 or 5 pieces out of one strip depending on the width of your fabric. You can put your excess strips under a book or wrap them on a cardboard roll to keep them flat while you are working through your other blocks. To make sure that our strips are going to be perfectly straight and centered, mark a line that is ½ inch away from the seam on one side and ½ inch away from the seam on the other side. I am now marking a line that is ½ inch away from the top and ½ inch away from the bottom edge. I can now position my strip over the raw seam in between the marked lines. I'm using a water erasable pen. This gives me a nice dark line that I can easily see, and the blue mark just washes out with a wet sponge, as heat can make the lines permanent. Hold your strip in place with some pins and head to the machine to sew. Back of the machine, I'm going to use a pink colour thread to match my cover strip, and I also have pink in the bobbin. Now you want to use a medium tone thread because you're actually going to see that stitching on the front of the quilt also. So as we have dark, medium and light fabrics, I think the medium is going to be the best tone to just tie them with all of our other fabrics. To sew on the cover strips, I'm going to use an edge stitching foot. You may already have one of these feet, but if not, it's a great one to purchase because it's going to make sewing the cover strips on really easy. You may also have a walking foot with a stitch in the ditch plate. All you have to do is line the guide up on the foot with the edge of the cover strip and move your needle position over slightly so that you're going to have a distance from the edge of the cover strip to the needle that's about 2mm or a little bit less than 1/8 inch. If you don't have a foot like this, just use your standard foot and just judge that distance by eye. To start sewing, do a little reverse stitch at the very top edge of the block before you meet the cover strip. Then continue onto the cover strip, easing it through as you sew, removing the pins. I like to use my tailor's awl to help me to ease the fabric if necessary. Finish at the very bottom with a reverse stitch, then spin the block and do the same to the other side. The edge stitching foot makes it really easy, and I know that my stitching is going to be nice and straight. Double check that your stitching is nice on the back. If it's a little bit loose, you'll need to tighten up your top tension. This is what it looks like from the front. The stitching lines that attach the tram just look like quilting lines sewn ½ inch away from either side of the seam. So continue joining the blocks together to form the rows. Now you know how to join your blocks together. You're going to keep building on your quilt by joining the blocks together to form the rows. Make sure you have your blocks facing in the right direction before you join them. Start by joining the blocks together. Here's a tip. Before you sew 2 blocks together, pull on the edge of each block. You may have one that's a little bit stretchy and one that is more solid. Sew with the more solid block on top to stabilize the more stretchy block that's underneath. Continue pinning, or if you feel confident, you can join the blocks together without pins. I like to work on all of my cover strips at the same time per row. So start pressing all the seams open and marking up your ½ inch placement lines. I work on one side at a time, then spin the row to mark the lines on the other side. I follow this process to join all of the blocks together into rows, then I will join the rows together to make the complete quilt. To make it easy to sew, I roll up one edge and sew down the side of one strip. As I move on to the next strip, I roll up the inside edge and unroll the outside edge and sew down the same side of the strip. I continue doing this until I've sewn all of the strips on one side, and then I flip the row and do the same thing to the other side. You can hold these strips in place with fusible web or a washable fabric glue, but I found it was easy enough to just place the strip inside the guidelines and sew. And here is one whole row complete. This is what it will look like at the top, and don't worry, as these reverse stitches will be covered in the seam when you join the rows together. That's why it's very important to do the reverse stitch at the very top and bottom edge of each seam. Now that you have your rows, you can start joining them together. Start by placing 2 rows with the right sides together, aligning all of the seams. To make sure the stitching lines will line up from row to row, pin them by placing a pin through the stitching line on the top layer 1/4 inch away from the edge. Push the pin through to the other side and line it up with the stitching on the bottom layer 1/4 inch away from the edge also. Squeeze the 2 layers together and push the pin back up through the layers. This is what it will look like from underneath. Now this is an important step, so take your time. Pin your stitching line on the other side of the cover strip and continue pinning each seam in the same way. Sew the rows together with your 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to the seam, slide the pin out and ease the foot gently over. Sometimes you are going to need to ease the top layer. To do this, push the excess fabric towards the foot and hold the work taut from behind and in front, or use the tailor's awl. Continue sewing the rows together, stopping to adjust and ease through. Take your time. This is what it will look like from the front. Double check all your stitching lines are lining up. Now I'm going to flip it over to the back and press the seam open. It can be bulky at the join because we have a lot of seams aligning at this point, but it will be fine when we sew our cover strip on top of it. Give it a press from the top also. Mark your guidelines. I like to do one side at a time, moving the ruler along as I go, and then I spin the quilt to mark the other side. So grab another strip and you will see that it's not long enough, so we are going to need to make some joins. To do this, place one strip with the right side facing up in a horizontal direction. Place your next strip with the right side facing down in a vertical direction, extending the edges past each other by about 1.5 centimeters or 1/2 inch. Take your ruler and mark a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Pop in a pin and sew on the marked line with a stitch length of 2.5. Open out the strip to make sure that it is running straight. Now this is a 45-degree join, and we do this to even out the bulk of the seam allowance. If everything is okay, trim away the excess fabric, trimming 1/4 inch away from the stitching line. Press the seam open and cut away the excess corners. Prepare your strip with the bias maker in the same way. When you get to the seam, make sure that the seams are laying flat and then continue sliding the strip through. Before I press that section, I like to just double check that it's all nice and flat and then push it in place and continue pressing. Place your cover strips over the seam. You can pin it in place or you can hold it in place with some washable fabric glue, but I found that it was really easy just to hold the cover strip in place and sew. Sew your cover strips on this longer seam in the same way that you did with your shorter seam, but when you get to the joins, scrape any loose threads underneath the cover strip. It's easier to do this than trimming them away. And then sew across the join. I like to work in sections of about 10 centimeters or 4 inches. I smooth the cover strip in place and ease it through bit by bit at a time. So take your time with it and find your own rhythm, sewing down one side and then spinning around and sewing down the other side of the cover strip. And here are my rows starting to be joined together. As your quilt grows, roll it up so that you can easily slide it through the machine. As the quilt gets heavier, I like to use one hand to smooth the strip out and hold it in place, and then the other hand I put underneath to take the weight of the quilt to help it easily slide through the machine. So keep joining all your rows together in this way. All joined together. I'm so happy with how it turned out, and it looks beautiful on the back as well. Lay one strip horizontal with the right side facing up. Place another strip on top vertical with the right side facing down. Stitch a diagonal line from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. You can either judge this by eye or mark a line and stitch on the marked line. Now trim away the excess, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Do this to all joins. Once you have done that, press all the seams open. This will give you one long binding strip. Now fold it in half lengthwise with the wrong sides facing and press. And here is our binding strip. So cut away any excess corners and trim one end straight. Let's call this straight end end A, and this is the end that we are going to start sewing onto the quilt. The finishing end of the binding we are going to call end B. Before you sew the binding onto the quilt, check that all edges are level and trim if necessary. Once all your edges are straight, mark a line on the wrong side of the quilt that is 1 inch away from the edge around all 4 sides of the quilt using a fabric marker. Now head to the machine to sew the binding on the front of the quilt. Take the binding starting with end A and position the raw edges against the raw edge of the quilt. Measure 10 inches or 25 centimeters from end A and mark with a pin. We're going to start sewing from the pin, and this is going to give us a 10 inch or 25 centimeter tail. I'm using matching color binding thread on the top and in the bobbin and a stitch length of 3, and we are going to use a 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Start sewing, smoothing the binding out and holding it taut as you sew. The binding seam will hide those little reverse stitches on the very edge of the quilt. When you get near the corner, measure 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from the corner and pop a pin in the binding. Sew level to the pin and finish with a couple of reverse stitches. Take the quilt out from the machine and rotate it to the next edge as we are going to make a mitered corner. Fold the binding up, making a 45-degree fold from the corner of the quilt. Then fold the binding down so that the top folded edge is level with the horizontal edge of the quilt. Slide it under the machine and start sewing from the top edge. There is no need for a reverse stitch, as that stitching line will be hidden in the mitered corner, as you will soon see. Then continue sewing, following this process for all corners, adjusting your work as you sew and taking your time. Sometimes our joins will end up in the mitered corners. That's okay, just keep sewing in the same way, because the 45-degree joins of the binding allows for even distribution of the bulk in the seam allowance. Continue sewing your binding around the edge of the quilt in the same way. As you approach end A, you are going to stop sewing 10 inches or 25 centimeters away from that end. Mark with a pin and finish sewing there. Take your work out from the machine. So I overlapped the ends of the binding and I measured 3 3/4 inches away from end A and transferred this mark onto end B, and I trimmed away the excess of the tails, and this is what it will look like. So open out at end A and measure 3 3/4 inches along the top of the binding and make a mark. Then connect this mark with the bottom right-hand corner of the binding and mark your 45-degree line. Open out both ends of the binding and place them right sides together. Rotate end A up and place level with end B, and pin together on the marked diagonal line. This is what it will look like on the back, and you can open out the binding to refold and make sure that this join is going to be correct and fits nicely along the edge of the quilt. Then head to the machine and sew along the marked line. Once again, double check your join is correct and then trim away the excess fabric so you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Finger press the seam open, then fold the binding in half again and pin onto the edge of the quilt, then head back to the machine to finish sewing the binding. So at this point we have sewn the binding onto the front of the quilt, and now we need to fold it over to finish it on the back of the quilt. So start with your quilt top facing up and press the binding away from the edge of the quilt. Be careful to use the tip of the iron in the seam if you used a wash away blue marker, as heat could make the lines permanent. Now, working with the back of the quilt facing up, fold the binding over so that the folded edge meets our previously marked line, and then pin on the right side of your quilt in the seam, or in quilting terms, the ditch of the seam. So keep pinning all the way around, placing your pins 4 inches or 10 centimeters apart. When you approach the corners, you will see that you have a mitre on the front already. Before we deal with the mitres on the back, continue with another 2 pins along the next edge in the same way. Now, using either a large pin or a tailor's awl, fold the binding on the back so it forms a 45-degree angle, just like that. Pop 1 pin in on the fold to secure it. Continue pinning the binding around the edge of the quilt. time to stitch the binding in place. We are going to do this from the top of the quilt, and we want our stitching line to be the same distance from the cover strip stitching line. You will see it's a fraction less than ½ inch, or if we are talking in metric, it's about 12 millimeters. So measure that distance from the seam of the binding, and using your standard foot, position the edge of the standard foot on the binding seam and move your needle position over so that you have the same distance as your other quilting lines from the seam to the needle. I've got a stitch length of 3 and I'm using the same thread as the stitching lines on the top of the quilt and a thread in the bobbin to match the binding. Start sewing. All you have to do is rest the edge of the foot against the binding seam and sew, sliding the pins out as you go. This is what it will look like from the back. You will see that the back of the binding has been caught in the stitching line. To sew a corner, take that pin and turn it around so that the end of the pin is extending past the quilt edge so that it can be easily removed as you sew the mitered corner. And this is what it looks like on the back. So continue sewing your binding in place. To finish, overlap the stitching line and bring your stitch length down to 0.2, so 6 or 7 stitches close together. Take your work out from the machine and trim any excess threads. So there's always more than one way to do something, so if you like, using a hand sewing needle, you can bed those threads in between the layers of the quilt. And also, if you like, you can secure those miters in place with a little bit of hand stitching. And here is my quilt all finished. Trim away any excess threads, and if you used a wash away marker, remove the lines with a damp sponge. So that's how you make a quilt from start to finish Quilt-as-you-go. I hope that you enjoyed this series and maybe learned something new along the way. Thanks for watching, bye!